D.C. today, bracing for the return of Donald Trump to the presidency. Within the last hour, Trump making clear just what kind of presidency he had in mind all along by naming Congressman Matt Gaetz as his choice to be the country's attorney general. Trump making that news in a social media post by saying that Gaetz will, quote, end weaponized government, which is in and of itself a delusion of the far right. It is yet another sign, though, that Donald Trump is rewarding loyalty this time above everything else as he builds a new cabinet. Since Gaetz was all in on Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election. In fact, he was so concerned about his criminal exposure that he asked Donald Trump for a pardon in the last days of Trump's first presidency. Gaetz was also under investigation for sex trafficking as recently as 2023. He will now lead the department that once investigated him, should he be confirmed. That breaking news is where we start today with former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, Andrew Weissmann, and former Democratic Senator and MSNBC political analyst, Claire McCaskill. So, Andrew Weissmann, this to me, while shocking and galling, is the least surprising thing Trump has done since he won. I think since he won Tuesday night, yesterday he put Marco Rubio atop the State Department, and people at this table said, oh, this isn't going to be so bad. On Monday, he made the announcement that he would turn to recess appointments. It's obvious that this trio of Fox News anchors, Matt Gaetz, whose biggest war in Washington is with Kevin McCarthy, and Tulsi Gabbard, was what the recess appointment was all about.
Yeah, I sort of had two reactions to this announcement, and one is very similar to yours, which is we have in the president-elect somebody who is clearly not tethered to facts or law. With respect to facts, we know he has said repeatedly that there was a fraud in the election and he won it, and we know that is not true, and he lost all of the cases but one, and that one was on some technical issue. So he is adhering to a world where facts and law don't matter. And so we shouldn't be surprised that he has selected to nominate, yet to be confirmed, somebody for the Attorney General and somebody for the Department of National Intelligence that are not just unqualified, but have shown that they're untethered to the facts and maybe also the law. So that shouldn't be surprising. And the other is really this idea of that somehow Matt Gaetz is going to be the person who prevents and stops weaponization when he is the exhibit A to weaponization. I mean, we are in pure George Orwell 1984 land where, they say black is white and we're supposed to believe it.
Claire, the rub is that people like Matt Gaetz are, well, let me just show you. They're laughing stocks on the right. Let me show you what Claire's in here. Oh, we're working on this, but let me share some of the things that folks on the right have said about him with you, Claire. Eric Hirschman, who was White House counsel for Donald Trump, I think the country got to know him during the January 6th Select Committee hearings, confirmed on the record in his deposition. When asked, was Representative Gaetz requesting a pardon? Eric Hirschman, I believe so. The general tone was, we may get prosecuted because we were defensive of the president's positions on things. Question, how do you know that Congressman Gaetz asked for a pardon? John McEntee, he told me. Tell me about that. John McEntee, he told me he'd asked Meadows for a pardon. Cassidy Hutchinson, Gaetz was personally pushing for a pardon, and he was doing so since early December. Asked by Adam Kinzinger, the only reason I know to ask for a pardon is because you think you've committed a crime. Claire, this is the kind of person you also install if your plan is what you talked about on the campaign trail and what you insisted, even in friendly interviews, wasn't your plan, and that's retribution.
Yeah, there's a couple of things about this. First, I have to think that there are more than 4 votes that would not show up for Matt Gaetz in the Republican caucus. I did a quick rundown of the Republican senators, and I came up with 11 names that I think would likely oppose a Matt Gaetz. Now, half or more of those could disappoint America and vote for someone who is so wholly unqualified for this job in so many ways. But is Donald Trump nominating him so that he can get Tulsi Gabbard through, or maybe this Fox News contributor? You know, we've gone from only hiring the best people to only hiring people that are completely unqualified for the jobs that they are being nominated for. You know, the Fox News guy, he's never run anything. And this is a huge enterprise, the Department of Defense. Matt Gaetz has no experience that would lend itself towards running the Department of Justice and everything that's involved there. And people think the Department of Justice is just about, you know, who's getting prosecuted, that we're talking about on national news. We're talking about a huge swath of criminals in this country and running a department with integrity, going after bad guys that are breaking the law, whether it's drugs or bank robberies or other serious crimes, criminal enterprises that are complex and difficult. I mean, Andrew can tell you all this. It is shocking. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be shocked, but it sure is nervy for somebody who has his own ethical problems to be nominated for a job that has had really some stellar men and women running that department in my lifetime and, frankly, in the history of this country.
I want to make sure that we don't sort of follow the shiny object of the Matt Gaetz of it all. And I would like to ask you, Andrew, to take the Fox Weekend host, Mr. Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and Matt Gaetz as a piece, and just articulate for me what the Director of National Intelligence, the Department of Defense, and the U.S. Department of Justice do on, say, a September 11th-like tragedy for the nation. What are the roles of those three agencies?
It's funny. That's exactly where I was going, because post 9/11, what you do in the intelligence community, at the Department of Defense, at the CIA, at the Department of Justice, at the FBI, is you do all of the things within the FBI and the department that Claire talked about, sort of domestic criminal law enforcement. And obviously those can be incredibly important. They can involve murder and rape and child pornography and the kinds of crimes that everyone listening would find horrendous and have to be prevented and prosecuted. But post 9/11, this is a very dangerous and serious world. It is absolutely imperative that those agencies are operated by experienced adults, people who know what they're doing, who can make this country safe. Part of that is knowing the intelligence community, understanding triage, what are real threats, what are not so real threats, and also being able to build really important relationships with countries around the world, those who are sort of publicly friendly to us and those who are willing to be friendly and provide information, but in a quiet way. So having those diplomatic skills is incredibly important in order to make this country safe. Just to be clear, it's about safety of Americans and other people living in this country. Having people who are not qualified or not serious is something that endangers this country. I have to say, like, sort of first reaction to these nominations is that they must be sort of like test balloons, because it's so unimaginable that that is what you would do for a topic that is so serious. And I really, truly hope that Claire is right, that we're going to see that sort of adult supervision come from the Senate in an area that is so important to all of our safety.
Well, and I guess, you know, the only thing that I would say before everyone loses their collective minds here over the lack of seriousness is that Donald Trump wasn't elected to put Tulsi Gabbard in charge of national security or Matt Gaetz in charge of the Department of Justice or the Fox Weekend guy whose name what is his name? Pete Hegseth. Can I get a spelling? Hegseth. So Donald Trump was elected to do one thing: keep Americans safe. That's what his voters would tell you. And that means economically secure and safe from, let me quote Trump, criminal gangs. Who deals with criminal gangs, Claire? Might it be anyone at DOJ? I mean, who deals with Iran, a country that Donald Trump says is running all over the USA? Might it be DOD or the intelligence community? Donald Trump can't leave unserious people in charge of the things that are the very reason his base of supporters turned out and voted for him.
Oh, this was a name that we had sources that had been telling us that Tulsi Gabbard, the former Democratic Congresswoman turned Republican, would be tapped for the Director of National Intelligence role. And just here in the last moments, that's exactly what happened. Donald Trump announcing that Tulsi Gabbard will take the reins, if confirmed by the U.S. Senate, of the office of the Director of National Intelligence. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, of course, is somebody who rose to prominence back in 2017 when she took a secret trip to Syria to meet with President Bashar al-Assad. At the time, he was alleged to have ordered the killings of hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians. It was a trip that was repudiated by Democrats and Republicans alike at the time that ultimately the U.S. was determining how it would engage and respond to the killings of civilians. And in the aftermath of that, she was hesitant to call him a dictator and was hesitant to condemn him for the actions that were taking place in Syria. Ultimately, she ran for president in 2019 as a Democrat. She was somebody that irked a great many other Democrats on that stage, taking on memorably then Senator Kamala Harris. Ultimately, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, she ended up going and making her presence on Fox News routine before becoming a close ally of Tucker Carlson, and somebody who then closely aligned herself with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. before just a couple weeks ago at a campaign rally that I was at in Michigan, going up on stage and declaring that she was now officially a member of the Republican Party because of Donald Trump and had sought to play a key role in his administration. She was, I'm told, an honorary chair on this transition team here, and now Donald Trump clearly trusting of Tulsi Gabbard and placing her in this critical national intelligence position.
All right, so Courtney, her in that role, I mean, she's the air traffic controller, if you will, of intelligence, which going to come from the Pentagon, it's going to come from the CIA, the FBI, also from the national security team within the White House. Tell me a little bit about what it means to have her in a role like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the huge question here is, what is this going to mean for career intelligence officers? How are they going to see someone who, as we just heard Vaughn say, met with Bashar al-Assad and said that he is not the enemy of the people? And at the time, there was a tremendous amount of outcry about the fact that she was defending someone who had slaughtered his own people and was in an ongoing campaign of killing civilians in his country and virtually allowing ISIS to build up, who were also tormenting the civilians in his country, while at the same time allowing Russia to move into the country and also terrorize the population. So it's a surprising development that she would be put in charge of the intelligence community, because, as you mentioned, Katie, air traffic controller is a very interesting way to put this, because for all intents and purposes, the other intelligence agencies all essentially root through the Director of National Intelligence. Yeah. So it's a very powerful position. It's almost like, as you said, it's a gatherer, but it's also an aggregator of that information, that intelligence. And we all know Donald Trump has been very outspoken, and many people around him, about their feelings that they don't trust the U.S. intelligence agencies and they don't trust their products. So the huge question now is, how could that manifest with a Tulsi Gabbard at the head of that agency?
We have Richard Haass standing by for us. I want to bring him in a second, but because he's going to have a lot to weigh in on here. But Jake, I want to ask you first, confirmation for Tulsi Gabbard, would she meet any resistance?
This is going to be the most difficult nomination to get through the United States Senate, period, hard stop. I mean, this and Hegseth, right? I mean, I don't know that Tulsi Gabbard gets confirmed by the Senate. Let me just put it that way. Again, he has chosen a lot of people with easy paths to confirmation. John Ratcliffe at the CIA, Marco Rubio, Kristi Noem, all of those folks will get confirmed. I mean, Marco Rubio could probably almost get confirmed on voice vote. He won't, but he probably could get close. Tulsi Gabbard is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And it's just a tough pill to swallow because senators are, as we just saw, Katie, in the Senate leadership race earlier today, the whole right Trump Twitter sphere went crazy over Rick Scott and all of that and said he should be the leader, and senators didn't really care. So I think you're going to see a lot of that when it comes to these nominations. And remember, Mitch McConnell is another free agent when it comes to these nominations. He has 2 years left in his Senate term. He is no longer in Senate Republican leadership. He has been very critical of Trump in this new biography that came out. He thinks Trump is an unserious person, and I think he'll share the opinion that some of these nominees are not serious people. So Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth are going to be two incredibly difficult nomination processes.
We will watch and see. We're going to learn a lot about what Congress is going to be like and what they're going to rubber stamp with Donald Trump in these confirmation processes coming up in January. All right, Von Hilliard, Courtney Kube, Jake Sherman, thank you very much.
Late today, President-elect Donald Trump naming hardline MAGA conservative Matt Gaetz as his pick for Attorney General. The nomination comes as Donald Trump is already facing scrutiny for really this series of unusual picks for top posts, from Pentagon to the intelligence community. What I was just discussing with our colleague Nicole Wallace and what has been reverberating across Washington and anyone who's still following the news since the election over the last, say, 48 hours. Now, many people view Matt Gaetz as the most extreme in this group. It depends, of course, how you count it and what evidence you use. But Matt Gaetz is a self-avowed and admitted partisan warrior. That's the opposite of the nonpartisan credentials sought for the nation's top law enforcement officer. Gaetz moved to the right of his own Republican leadership in the House. Famously, he helped dethrone a speaker who had been meeting with Donald Trump and arguing that he was Trump enough. Gaetz faced his own federal investigation for his own conduct, although he was not charged in that. But even in the polarized MAGA era, Matt Gaetz has been decried by his fellow Republicans as well as Democrats and other observers alike for putting the flame-throwing, vicious partisan antics that he is known for above any semblance or even gesture towards cooperation or caring about Congress's duties and the national interest.
I've made it a living hell for the swamp rats, and many of them are retiring now. If the Republicans are in the majority and I have subpoena power, I will personally investigate BLM like I'm a Soros-funded prosecutor going after the Trump organization.
We're ashamed of nothing. Seize the day. We're proud of the work that we did on January 6th to make legitimate arguments about election integrity. We are going to go after this administrative state, and we're going to start at the Department of Justice and the FBI.
We either get this government back on our side or we defund and get rid of, abolish the FBI, CDC, ATF, DOJ, every last one of them.
Those are his words in public. This is who Matt Gaetz is. And so here's what we're making sense of right now. Donald Trump, by tapping a partisan who vowed to, quote, go after DOJ, is doubling down on his clear, repeated public vows of retribution, of abusing power in ways that would clearly be potentially illegal or unconstitutional. These were the things that people sometimes said over the past months were not his focus, or it was him being off message, or get him returned to policy. No, this is the priority. You can see it in the personnel. It's what he intends to do with your federal government. And these are measures that, to be clear, very few politicians openly admit, and which could saddle any future cases with claims of selective prosecution if Gaetz or other individuals go down this road with the power they would get in January if confirmed. Matt Gaetz built his career on a swift rise from a relatively obscure Florida backbencher to a MAGA lightning rod by helping Trump with exactly the projects that other Republicans would not join, including a role in trying to help overthrow Trump's 2020 loss. That is a failed effort which had Gaetz embroiled in the Jan 6 coup investigation, where Trump White House and other Republican aides testified under oath that Gates then was seeking a pardon for himself. Pardons, of course, are for criminals, for people seeking to get away from what they think would otherwise land them in jail. He was concerned about getting charged for his conduct. Trump's effort to elevate such a person to be the chief law enforcement officer is quite literally, quite substantively extreme. And no one this partisan has even been floated for a DOJ in either party since back to the Nixon era. The partisan disqualifications at stake here are not secret. They're not even disputed by Gates, who clashed with, of course, many Democrats and journalists, but ultimately his own Republican speaker on the House floor. If you remember this whole standoff while the cameras rolled, Gates has repeatedly appeared on this program and also touted the same qualities that have always traditionally been disqualifying at DOJ: intense partisanship, breaking rules, putting politics above your oath of office. And so briefly, I want to show you tonight, we did ask him about the Republicans who testified that he sought a pardon from criminal prosecution, which is now relevant as he is awaiting a Senate set of hearings about whether he will then take the power of overseeing criminal probes. If a pardon was requested, why not just tell us what were you worried about? What was it that you thought you or others might be indicted for?
I do not remember it the same way Eric Hirschman does. Hold on now.
Mr. McEntee, no, I'm going to let you finish, but is Mr. McEntee a liar as well? And yes, you may finish.
Well, I had a lot of conversations with Mr. McEntee about pardons for other folks and different groups of people. When it comes to, was I asking something specifically for me and only me under those circumstances? The answer would be no.
Gates' answer, acknowledging plural pardon conversations, but issuing that kind of narrow denial that if he did ask for anything, he didn't ask only for himself. And these cabinet nominees must get through the U.S. Senate. The Constitution puts a clear limit on presidential appointments. It's actually in the very second section, after the first, dealing with executive power and saying the president shall nominate officers of the U.S. only by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. Very clear. This is a rule the Senate has always cared about and that courts have generally enforced, with some rare exceptions for recess appointments. There's no precedent for breaking this rule with a high-ranking post like Attorney General or Defense Secretary at the beginning of an administration when there isn't a recess with the intent to serve potentially up to 4 years, for putting people in those top jobs without Senate approval. One Republican senator today is already publicly expressing concern about Gates. Several House Republicans reportedly gasped when hearing the Gates news today in a closed-door party meeting. Again, quoting my colleague Nicole Wallace, the shock comes first, but is not necessarily the point. As for inside the Department of Justice, officials who are familiar with many of Donald Trump's approaches still found the idea of Gates running this department as laughable, insane, and he obviously shouldn't be confirmable. So what's going on tonight? This is one of several early moves by President-elect Trump to rattle the system and to test what he might get away with while politically trying to overload everything so he gets away with more. In that sense, we have seen this plan before, this type of blueprint, although quite frankly, we have never seen, even in the first term, Trump put someone like Gates up to run DOJ. But remember what else we saw this week? A written plan to purge generals, which was basically handed over to the Fox News sister publication, The Wall Street Journal, in what they often call a trial balloon. He didn't just go ahead and do it. He tried to put out this leak that he might try to purge generals. This is after a tough set of news cycles where his campaign was running away from all the accusations from Republicans that he had said privately he wanted, quote, Hitler's generals. So this is real. This is also a test. These are things Donald Trump wants to do by virtue of the fact that he is trying to do them. But these are also tests of these Senate Republicans and what he calls his mandate or honeymoon period that presidents get. There was clearly not a lot of vetting or a lot of consultation, advice, and consent with the Senate. It is a test to see what he can get away with, and it is a test to see whether you and citizens of this country who are understandably maybe a little tired of all this and just exhausted by an election we lived through, but whether you are still paying attention. As promised, I'm joined by two veterans of the DOJ, former U.S. Attorney for the famed Southern District of New York, David Kelly, also my former boss, and Barrett Berger, a former federal prosecutor in that and the Eastern District of New York. Welcome to both of you. David, for someone watching and thinking there are debates over all kinds of nominees, where does Matt Gaetz fit into normal, historically somewhat more political, ideological, or completely off the table?
I think it's more the latter. Look, the president has the power to, put up anybody he wants. But traditionally, this goes to somebody who is not political, who is apolitical, who is maybe partisan but doesn't express the partisanship in carrying out their duties. And here you have somebody who is expressly saying the reason why he wants the job is to do just that, to engage as a partisan warrior and using the Justice Department to do that. Now, it's one thing to say that, and it's yet another thing to do that. And that proof will be in the pudding whether or not that's something he actually tries to do. And if he tries to do it or does do it, I think it would be quite a shock to the whole system.
Barrett, you know who doesn't think Matt Gaetz is Senate confirmable is Matt Gaetz. I've mentioned that some of the things we have reported that might sound critical are just things he's admitted to. And so this is, as I say, coming from Trump but going towards the Senate. This was just last year who was Matt Gaetz.
For many of the crimes that we are observing, the statute of limitations is 5 years. And so we could send criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. We go take the White House back, and you never know, David, it may be an Attorney General Matt Gaetz down the road or someone of my liking who will be there to actually enforce the law and provide the accountability.
I like that. Attorney General Matt Gaetz. Are you kidding me? Man.
The world is not ready, probably. Certainly Senate confirmation wouldn't be. But,
well, we're getting
a
there.
boy can dream.
Certainly Senate confirmation wouldn't be, he said.
I feel like you just manifested that into being, right, by talking about it. I mean, look, I think the significance of Matt Gaetz as the Attorney General, there's really three main ways, right? The first is that he would enforce the president's priorities. Big priorities that we talk about all the time, like mass deportations, and then more everyday ones. What positions are prosecutors in the Department of Justice going to be taking on sentencing issues? The second is he has the ability, as we've been discussing a lot, to shut down criminal cases, investigations into President-elect Trump, which certainly he will and has expressed willingness to do that. And the third, I think, is the most significant, and that's that the Attorney General, and we both worked under many different Attorney Generals, but they set the tone for the top. Is this going to be a department that's committed to transparency, to ethics, to independence, or is this going to be a department that is used for political retribution?
Where does he stack up against recent attorneys general?
Well, he stacks up in the sense that he does not have experience as a former prosecutor. I mean, that's a big departure that we've seen from former AGs.
This is what Steve Bannon has been saying, David, in concert with all of this effort to take the powers of the DOJ and turn it into what normally would be illegal political vendettas.
Biden's getting swept out. Kamala Harris is getting swept out. MSNBC is getting swept out. The Justice Department's getting swept out. The FBI is getting swept out. You people suck, okay? And now you're going to pay the price for trying to destroy this country.
I don't know if there's really words to respond to that. Look, it certainly sounds like, excessive abuse of power if Steve Bannon had any. But, that's a lot of talk. The question is, how, if at all, would they be able to execute that in a lawful fashion?
Joining us now, Virginia Senator Mark Warner, chair of the Intelligence Committee. You've worked so closely with Marco Rubio. He's been the vice chair, but really much a partner of yours. How do you assess him as the choice for Secretary of State?
Well, Andrea, first of all, I don't get to make Trump administration personnel decisions, and, the president-elect has still not put forward anybody's name. But if Marco is put forward as Secretary of State, I think it's be a strong choice. He and I don't agree on a lot of things, but we've always found a way to work together. And I think most importantly, he knows and understands the absolutely critical role that our American leadership plays.
And Senator, what about China? Yes. Because he is considerably more hawkish, I think, than you are on China.
Well, I think we've never faced a challenge like China where we have an economic competitor across so many technology domains. He may have gone further than I in certain areas, but I think having somebody that's vigilant against China's, particularly technology advancement that's direct competition to us, I think having that voice is important.
And Senator Rubio is not the only, choice that we've been talking about here today. A very surprising choice to a lot of people is Pete Hegseth of Fox News, a television person more than anything else. Pete Hegseth for the Pentagon. He is a military veteran from both Iraq and Afghanistan, but he's never managed an $800 billion budget or $1.3 million, active duty forces.
Yeah, Andrea, I respect this gentleman's service, and I know he's been a decorated veteran, but I've been to the Pentagon many times. It takes a while to find the bathroom. You're talking about the largest workforce in America, and that's just with the official Pentagon employees. You've also got all of the contractor community. To throw someone in with no management experience into this enterprise, particularly if on one hand you've got other folks in the Trump orbit talking about bringing government efficiency, I'm going to meet the guy and I'll make an assessment, but that's an awful big hill to climb, because I don't understand how that corresponds with trying to have somebody that's going to bring efficiency to the government.
What about the choice of John Ratcliffe for CIA?
I worked with John Ratcliffe when he was DNI. I even supported him for that position. While initially I did not, but CIA I've got some questions. I respect Ratcliffe's service, but I'm going to have some important questions before I weigh in on his nomination for CIA director.
And Special Counsel Jack Smith is going to resign, we are told, before Donald Trump can fire him, issuing a report. But a source familiar with the matter tells us that we can expect to see that report from Jack Smith. What's your reaction to that being the outcome? Of course, the Supreme Court's immunity decision put a cold stop and slowed down that prosecution.
I wish. I think for the American people, it would have been good to go ahead and litigate this so this cloud is not overhanging. I wish, in retrospect, obviously, this could have been moved quicker, but I'm not surprised at all. In light of the immunity decision, that Jack Smith is going to finish his job and get out of Dodge or get out of that position before Donald Trump comes in. Doesn't surprise me at all.
And we also know that there's a new ambassador chosen for Israel subject to confirmation, and that is Mike Huckabee, who has said that he's in favor of annexation of the West Bank and has some notable views on that, as well as Steve Witkoff, a real estate guy and a head of the inaugural committee, a big Trump friend and golf partner and donor, to be the new envoy, the new diplomat to the Middle East. What does that tell you?
Mr. Witkoff, I don't know. Actually, Mike Huckabee and I worked closely together when we were both heads of the National Governors Association. I've known him a long time. Like him interpersonally. I don't know how you get the geopolitical movement that I think we would all like to see in the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, and others, I think, are ready to kind of come into more alliance with us and Israel, if at the same time you're snuffing out any opportunity for a Palestinian state. I don't know how those are ever reconcilable. And if that's why Israel has been, remarkable in terms of particularly taking out Hezbollah, but we need to get to a ceasefire so that we can start to have that realignment. I think a lot of that goes off the table if you suddenly see a full annexation of the West Bank.
And instead of a ceasefire, which was called on again today by Secretary Blinken in Brussels, at NATO, we're seeing increasing Israeli attacks in northern Gaza, a humanitarian crisis, according to the UN, but the administration pulled back on its threat, really, to start pulling back weapons, according to the Leahy Act. Just yesterday, when that deadline came and went, they're not going to cut off any weapons. They say that Israel is making, quote, progress.
Listen, I've not seen the full report. I want to look at this, but I think the notion that you're going to wipe out entirely a Hamas organization down to the last fighter, when frankly new fighters will spring up. This has always been a bit of the contradiction on the Israeli objectives, and why I think, when we had a bid earlier, we were so close so many times. I think Bill Burns, the current CIA director, ought to get get at least a prize for his efforts, where we were close to bringing back those hostages and bringing a ceasefire, because we've got to make a transition. Again, part of the role of rebuilding Gaza, I do think entities like the Emiratis, the Gulf states, the Saudis, we can ask and demand for them to do more in helping rebuild Gaza, but you got to have a cessation of hostilities.
And also, finally, your reaction to Senator Thune as the new Senate Majority Leader.
I've worked with John Thune on a lot of things, even like our first TikTok bill together. Again, I don't agree with John Thune on everything, and he's going to have to work. He's got a challenge to work with the president-elect and his caucus. But the thing about John Thune is, he's partisan, but he's always a decent guy, and that, I think, kind of basic decency is something that I imagine will be tested, but I'm looking forward to working with him.